The morning they left, I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee going cold in my hands and watched my son load the car. He didn't look up at the house. Not once. My daughter-in-law came out first, pulling a rolling suitcase that was too big for a 4-day trip. She had on a new linen outfit, cream-colored pressed, and sunglasses she pushed up into her hair before bending to check that the trunk latch had caught. Her mother followed behind her carrying a tote bag and a small cooler, moving slowly down the porch steps like she owned them. My son held the door open for his mother-in-law. I set my mug down on the counter. The plan had been decided 2 weeks ago, a long weekend at a resort on the Carolina coast, somewhere with a spa and a pool and views of the water. When my son told me about it at dinner, he said it the way you'd mention a dentist appointment. Casual. Already decided. He said his mother-in-law had been wanting to go for a long time, and that his wife had found a deal, and that they were going the 3rd week of May. I asked if I was invited. He looked at his plate, said the room only fit 3. I didn't push. I've never been the kind of woman who pushes. But that night I sat in the living room after the dishes were done. And I thought about the fact that his mother-in-law flew in from Phoenix twice a year and stayed in our guest room for 10 days at a stretch and was taken to dinner and driven to the outlets and treated like someone who needed to be entertained. And I lived 11 miles away and came over on Sundays and brought food that I cooked myself and left before 8 so they could have their evenings. I thought about that for a while. Then I went to bed. The morning they left, my son came inside once to get his phone charger off the kitchen counter. He said, "We're heading out," and I said, "Have a good trip," and that was all. My daughter-in-law waved from the driveway. Her mother was already in the back seat. I watched until the car turned out of the subdivision and disappeared behind the tree line. Then I locked up their house. I had a key for emergencies, and I drove back to my own place, and I went out to the garden because the tomatoes needed caging. And the soil along the back fence still hadn't been turned, and nobody was going to do it but me. I spent 3 hours out there. The neighbor's dog barked for a while and then settled. A cardinal kept landing on the bird bath. The morning was overcast and cool, and I was glad for that. I work better when it isn't hot. By noon I had 12 tomato cages in the ground, the soil turned along the fence, and a row of pole bean seeds in. I washed my hands at the outdoor spigot and stood there a minute, drying them on my jeans and looking at what I'd done. There is something about a garden in May. Something about having your hands in the ground. I went inside and made a sandwich and didn't think about the coast. I wouldn't have found it if I hadn't gone back. 2 days after they left, my son called to say the kitchen faucet had been dripping and he thought I should check it before it got worse. He'd been meaning to tell me before they left, he said, and he was sorry he forgot. He said there was a wrench in the cabinet under the sink, and it was probably just the washer. He said it like I'd never fixed a faucet before in my life. I drove over that afternoon. The faucet was fine, not dripping at all. Maybe a slow drip, the kind that takes 3 seconds between drops. But I tightened the fitting anyway and wiped down under the cabinet with a rag. I was putting the wrench back when I noticed the folder. It was tucked behind the extra garbage bags and a rusted can of WD-40 wedged between the cabinet wall and the drain pipe. A manila folder, a little bent, with nothing written on the front. I don't know why I picked it up. Maybe I thought it was something they'd shoved back there and forgotten. Instructions for an appliance. An old takeout menu. You find things in odd places when you've been in someone's house for years. I opened it on the kitchen floor, still crouching. There were 3 pages inside. The first was a printout from an insurance company. Life insurance. The insured's name was mine. The beneficiary was my son and his wife, listed equally. The policy face value was $400,000, and the date in the upper right corner was April 28th. That was 18 days ago. I read it again. Then I read it a 3rd time. My hands were very still. The second page was a summary of coverage and premium schedule. The third was a form, partially filled out but not signed. There was a line at the bottom that said signature of insured, and the line was blank. I thought they were going to ask me to sign something, or they were going to find another way. I sat there on the kitchen floor for a while. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went by slowly, windows down, music playing. I could hear birds. I put the pages back exactly as I found them. I put the folder back behind the garbage bags. I pushed it the same way it had been sitting, at the same angle. Then I stood up, rinsed my hands, and let myself out. On the drive home, I didn't turn the radio on. I just drove and thought. The thing about a discovery like that is that it doesn't feel like anything at first. It comes in slowly, the way cold does when you've been sitting outside too long. Not a shock, just a gradual awareness that something is wrong. I'd known something was off for months. I just hadn't known what shape it was. Now I did. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad and a pen, and I made a list. Not of feelings. I've never been very useful with feelings in real time. I make lists. I wrote down everything I could remember about the past year, every conversation that had felt slightly off, every time my son had mentioned the house, the property, money, every time my daughter-in-law had asked a question that seemed, in retrospect, like something other than curiosity. There had been the conversation in November when she'd asked if I'd thought about doing a trust. I'd said I hadn't, not yet. She'd said, very pleasantly, that a lot of people were doing them now, that it was smart planning, that her cousin had done one, and it was so simple. She'd mentioned a lawyer she'd heard of. There had been the evening in February when my son sat across from me at my own dinner table and said, in a tone I now recognized as rehearsed, that he worried about the property, my house, the 2 acres it sat on, and what would happen to it if something happened to me. He said he just wanted to make sure things were handled properly. He used the word properly twice. I'd said I had a will. He'd said a will could take months to process in probate and that there were simpler ways to do things. I'd said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. Then there had been last month, 2 weeks before the trip, when my daughter-in-law called me on a Tuesday afternoon and asked if I'd gotten anything in the mail from an insurance company. Because she said she'd signed me up for some kind of free information packet and she wanted to make sure I'd received it. I said I didn't think so. She said no worries, she'd follow up. I wrote all of this down on the notepad. Then I picked up the phone and called my friend Paulette. Not the one on the list of names I need to avoid. This Paulette I've known since we were in the same church choir 40 years ago, and I asked her if she knew a good estate attorney who wasn't connected to anyone I knew. She gave me a name. I called that afternoon and made an appointment for the following Monday. The attorney's office was in a brick building near the courthouse, up a flight of stairs that needed new carpet. Her name was on the door in gold letters. She was younger than I expected, somewhere in her late 40s, with a direct manner that I liked immediately. I put the notepad on her desk, and she read it without comment. When she was done, she looked at me and said, "Tell me about the life insurance policy," I told her. She asked if I had ever consented to any life insurance policy being taken out in my name. I said I had not. She explained that in this state, an insurable interest policy on another person, without their knowledge or signature on the application, constituted a legal problem, the exact nature and severity of which would depend on how the application had been processed. She said the most important thing right now was to find out how the policy had been filed, who had submitted the application, and whether my signature or any other documentation associated with me had been used. She said she would need to send a records request to the insurance company. I said, "Please do." She also asked about my current estate documents. I told her I had a will drawn up 12 years ago after my husband passed. She asked if I had a durable power of attorney on file. I said I didn't. She said that was something we should address. I walked out of that office an hour later with a retainer agreement, a list of documents to gather, and the first clear feeling I'd had in weeks. I stopped at the pharmacy on the way home. I bought a small combination lockbox, the kind people use for passports, and that evening I went through my filing cabinet and gathered everything that mattered. Deed to the house, car title, banking records, my husband's pension paperwork, my own insurance policies, the will. I put it all in the lockbox. I put the lockbox in my closet on the top shelf behind a box of winter sweaters. Then I called my bank. I have had the same bank account since 1987. The same branch, more or less, though the building moved twice. I know the manager there, a man named Garrett who has worked there since he was 26 and is now somewhere past 50. And I called him directly rather than going through the main line. I asked him who had authorized access to my accounts. There was a pause. He said he'd pull it up. Another pause, longer this time. He said my son had been added as an authorized signer on two of my accounts, my checking account and a savings account, approximately 14 months ago. He said the addition had been authorized with documentation that included my signature. I told him I had no memory of signing anything of the sort. He said he understood, and that this was something we should discuss in person. I was in his office the next morning at 9 o'clock. I won't go into all of it. But by the end of that meeting, my son had been removed from both accounts. I had new account numbers on the savings. I had a new debit card ordered, and Garrett had flagged the prior authorization for review because the signature on file did not match the signature I provided that morning when they asked me to sign the updated form. I drove home in the rain. I thought about my son as a little boy, the way he used to come inside after playing in the yard and stand at the kitchen sink washing his hands while I stood beside him, and he would tell me about whatever he'd been thinking about out there. His serious small voice going on about turtles or cloud formations or whether dogs could dream. He was a sweet boy. He genuinely was. I thought about where that boy had gone and I didn't have an answer. They came home on a Sunday afternoon. My son called when they landed and said the trip had been wonderful, that the weather had been perfect, that his mother-in-law had really needed it. He said they'd found a great seafood place on the waterfront. He sounded relaxed and easy, the way people sound when they've had 4 days away from everything they're supposed to be worrying about. I said, "I'm glad you had a good time." He said, "Did you get the garden in okay?" I said, "I did." He said, "Good. Hey, one thing, I'm going to need to grab something from the kitchen cabinet next time I come by. No rush, just something I left there." I said, "Sure." We hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap. He didn't know yet. The bank change would show up when he tried to use the card he had on file. The card I had reported as lost and had replaced. The card I'd stopped worrying about because the accounts it was linked to no longer existed in their previous form. The insurance company's response to the attorney's records request was still pending, but we'd already learned enough. The application had been submitted under my name and included a copy of my driver's license and a check drawn on my checking account for the first premium. I had not written that check. The signature on it was not mine. I was not a woman who had ever, in 64 years of living, wanted to take her own child to court. I want to be clear about that. I didn't want it then, and I don't find any satisfaction in saying it now. But I also was not going to sign anything I hadn't read. I was not going to let my name be used without my knowledge, and I was not going to pretend I didn't know what I knew. My attorney had advised me to say nothing until the records were complete and we understood the full picture. I intended to follow that advice, so I waited. The call came 3 days later. My son called on a Wednesday evening, around 7, and the first thing I noticed was that his voice had changed. It was tight, a little too measured. He said, "Mom, something is wrong with the bank account. My card got declined at the grocery store. The app is showing a different account number." I said, "Yes, I know. I made some changes." He said, "What do you mean you made changes?" I said, "I updated the account structure, removed some authorizations." There was a silence. He said, "You removed me?" I said, "I did." Another silence. Longer. He said, "Why would you do that?" I said, "Because I found the folder in your kitchen, under the sink, behind the garbage bags." I heard him exhale. He didn't say anything for a moment. I listened to the silence and thought about how many different things that silence could mean. Surprise, calculation, genuine remorse, or just the mental scramble of someone realizing the ground had shifted. He said, Mom, that's not what it looks like." I said, "Tell me what it is then." He said, "Vivienne, that's his wife. She thought it would be a good idea to look into some coverage, and she wanted to get information first before bringing it up to you because she knew you'd say no. She wasn't trying to do anything wrong. She just wanted to have all the information." I said, "And the checking account, the authorized signer paperwork?" Another long silence. He said, "I thought you knew about that. She said she'd talk to you." I said, "I didn't sign that paperwork." He didn't respond to that directly. He said, "Mom, can we come over? Can we just sit down and talk about this?" I said, "Not right now. I have some things I'm working through with my attorney, and I think it's better if we wait until that process is finished." He said, "Your attorney?" "Mom, you don't need an attorney. This is family." And I thought, there it is. That's the sentence. That's the sentence they always use. This is family. as if being family is a reason to not look too closely at things, as if love is supposed to make you careless. I said, "I'll be in touch when I have more information. I love you." And I hung up. I sat in my chair by the window for a long time after that. The evening had gotten cool and the light was going golden through the glass, and the neighbor's elm was moving in a slow wind. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about my husband, who would have known exactly what to say in this situation. He always knew. And I thought about the fact that I'd been handling things alone for 11 years, and I was still here, and my house was still mine, and my name was still my name. The garden was in, the tomatoes were caged, the pole beans were already showing their first inch of growth along the fence. I thought, whatever comes next, I still have this. My attorney finished the records review the following week. What we found was not small. The life insurance application had been submitted with a copy of my driver's license, a voided check from my checking account, and a typed personal statement that was not written by me. The first premium, $212, had been drafted from my checking account on a date when I had not initiated any transactions. The policy had been active for 18 days before I discovered it. Additionally, the authorized signer documentation at the bank had been submitted with a form that had my name signed on it. The bank's comparison flagged it as a signature inconsistency, meaning it did not match my baseline signature on file from 1987, nor did it match the signature I provided during my visit with Garrett. We'd requested the original form be held for examination. My attorney walked me through the options plainly and without drama. We could pursue this criminally. The unauthorized signature and the fraudulent insurance application both had potential to rise to that level. We could also pursue it civilly to recover the premium that had been drafted without my consent and to ensure the policy was voided. Or we could wait to see if my son and his wife came forward with an explanation and restitution before taking further action. She did not tell me what to do. She laid it out and waited. I asked her, "What would you do?" She said, "I'd start with the insurance company, get the policy voided, recover the premium, file a formal report with the bank, and then I'd wait a reasonable amount of time to see if the family responds appropriately before deciding on next steps." That's what we did. The insurance policy was voided within 10 days. The premium was reversed to my account. The bank filed an internal report and flagged the accounts for monitoring. My son did not call again for 2 weeks. When he did, his voice was different from before, quieter, and something in it that sounded like it might have cost him something to pick up the phone. He said, "I want you to know that I didn't know about the signature. I want to say that clearly. I didn't know she was going to do that." I said, "Okay." He said, "I should have stopped it earlier. The whole insurance thing. She brought it up last fall and I thought she was trying to be responsible and I didn't look at it closely enough." "That was wrong," I said. "Yes, it was." He said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm genuinely sorry." I stayed quiet a moment. There's a way of apologizing that's really just asking to be forgiven quickly, asking for the discomfort to be over, and it doesn't sound that different from a real apology. I was listening for the difference. I said, "I believe you're sorry. I'm going to need some time." He said, "I understand." I said, "And Vivienne needs to understand that what was done with my name and my account is not something I'm going to overlook because we're family." He said, "I know. She knows." We spoke for another 10 minutes. When we hung up, I didn't feel better exactly, but I felt clearer. There is a difference. Better implies the problem went away. Clearer means I know where I stand. The pole beans reached the top of the trellis in late June. I've been gardening for 30 years, and I still get a small private pleasure out of that, watching something reach the height you hoped for. My husband used to say I talk to the plants. I probably do. My attorney called in July to say the bank's internal review had concluded, that the accounts were secure, and that no further fraudulent activity had been detected. She said she'd continue to monitor and that I should call her if anything seemed off. I thanked her. I thought about my daughter-in-law. I thought about her a lot during those weeks. She had not called me directly. She had sent a text message, a careful, formal text message that said she was deeply sorry for the harm caused and that she had not intended to hurt me. The message read like something that had been reviewed before it was sent. I read it twice, and then I put the phone face down on the counter and I went outside. I don't know entirely what she intended. I don't think I ever will. People rarely know entirely what they intend. The conscious mind tells one story and the hands do something else. What I know is what happened. My name was used without my consent. My money was used without my consent, and a policy was put in place to pay out upon my death without my knowledge. Whether that came from carelessness or calculation, I can't say. What I can say is that I am still here. The house is mine, the accounts are mine, my name is mine. Those facts are not small things. My son came over in August, alone. He knocked even though he has a key, and I thought that was right, that he understood something had changed, and that a key you've been given can be given back, even without anyone saying so. We sat on the back porch with iced tea, and we looked at the garden. The tomatoes had come in, more than I could use, honestly, and I'd been giving bags of them away at church. The pole beans were done. I had cosmos and zinnias along the fence because I believe in flowers for their own sake, he said. It looks beautiful, Mom, I said. It does, I miss coming out here. I didn't answer that right away. I picked up my glass and held it a moment and looked at the garden and thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about the boy who used to stand at the sink telling me about clouds and turtles. I thought about standing at the window watching him load a car without looking back at the house. I said, "You're welcome here, you know that. But things are going to be different now," he said. "How do you mean?" I said, "I mean, I'll have my attorney involved in anything financial. I mean, you'll need to ask before coming in when I'm not home. I mean, I'm going to be more careful, and I need you to be more careful too, about who you listen to and what you let happen in your house where I'm concerned." He nodded. He looked at his hands. He said, "I know I let things get out of hand. I knew something wasn't right, and I told myself it was fine." I said, "That's the part that's hardest for me." He nodded again. He didn't try to explain it away. We sat a while longer. The evening was warm, and the light was going sideways through the zinnia bed, and a mockingbird was doing its whole routine from the top of the elm. There were things between us that I didn't know how to resolve, and maybe wouldn't for a long time. But there were also 30 years of dinners and Sunday mornings, and a boy who used to tell me about cloud formations, and I wasn't going to throw that away without at least trying. We talked until it was dark. It wasn't everything resolved. It wasn't forgiveness handed over like a gift. It was more like two people who had a long history trying to figure out what that history was worth and what they were willing to do to keep it. When he left, he hugged me at the door. I hugged him back. I locked the door behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet. Then I went to the kitchen, washed the glasses, and turned off the lights one by one. The house was mine. The evening was mine. And tomorrow morning I would be up before 6, and there would be coffee in the garden in the early light, and I would be all right. I've learned at 64 that all right is not a small thing. It might be the most important thing there is.